And moving on to a completely different topic. Say you're visiting Israel and are unfortunately involved in a car accident. Well, these things can happen. What are you to do and what are your rights? Joining us now to answer these questions and more is advocate Moti Orange, the vice president of the Department of Traffic Violations of the Bar Association in Israel, and a lawyer at the firm Decker Pex Levy Rosenberg. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So car accidents, it's not something we like to think about, but of course they can happen. What do you need to know if you're involved in a car accident in terms of your rights?
So it's very important to know that every person who's involved in a car accident, he's eligible for compensation, which means once you are involved in a car accident, regardless whose fault it does not even matter whose fault it is. The Israeli law is on a no-fault basis, which means once people are covered with insurance, so the insurance must give them and must pay them the money for their bodily injury. So the insurance covers the compensation, and regardless, like I said, if it's their fault or not their fault, regardless if you're driving the car or if you're a pedestrian just walking on the street, always the insurance must cover you by law.
So, you mentioned bodily harm, but what comes to mind is what about, let's say, emotional harm, trauma, depression, anxiety, things that can happen after a car accident?
Also, depression that happens is regardless as a result of the car accident. Also, that's called a bodily damage. And as a result, also that the insurance is supposed to pay and supposed to cover. And also that makes a person eligible to get compensation and to be compensated.
So, you mentioned that anyone who has insurance is covered, which is also interesting whether you're responsible or not responsible. What happens if someone is injured but doesn't have insurance, or the full insurance, let's say?
So it's a very big issue if you're not covered with insurance. I must say that it's also a traffic violation when you're not covered with insurance, which means every driver is supposed to be covered. However, though, there is a fund called Karnit, and Karnit does give money and does give compensation for people who are not covered. However, though, it's very important to know that Karnit afterwards can sue the person who was supposed to be covered with insurance. Now, I must say that people who walk on the street, like pedestrians, they're always covered, because if they're involved in a car accident, whoever's supposed to pay their damage, their bodily damages, is the driver. So they're always covered. And if the driver is not covered with insurance, so then Karnit will pay the pedestrian, and afterwards Karnit is going to sue the driver. However, like I said, always you're supposed to drive with insurance. Only one more point on that issue, that if the driver was involved in a car accident and he himself was injured and he was not covered with insurance, there's sometimes that also he's eligible to get compensation. In every specific matter, I must recommend to check with an attorney.
And it's surprising to me that even if a person drove without insurance, that he's entitled to compensation.
Not only that, but sometimes even it happens that a person who was not covered with insurance even gets more than a person who was covered with insurance. Why is it like that? Because a person who's covered with insurance, by law in Israel, there's the top amount that you can be covered. However, though, if you're not covered with insurance, there's no top that you can reach. You can sue for any damages you had. However, though, I must say I strongly recommend to drive only with insurance, because it's also a violation by law, and also you don't want to take the chances by the certain scenarios that you do not supposed to, and you will not receive any compensation. So drive always with insurance. However, though, also if you drove without insurance, please call, check with an attorney, see the situation, and maybe also in that scenario, and also in that case, you're supposed to be compensated.
So definitely drive with insurance. And
No doubt about that.
these are very important points to know, to be aware of, that Israel or drivers here in Israel are eligible for compensation should they, God forbid, be in an accident. Moti Orange, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us about this very important issue.
Thank you.